The sky above Earth was quiet, but the silence held something strange as if the wind itself was waiting for something to arrive. The clouds moved slowly, but the feeling across the planet was one of unease in the skies far beyond what the eye could see. A massive object hovered in orbit, shaped like a crescent with its surface glowing faintly in dull blue patterns that shifted like tides. This was no natural thing, and not a creation of man. It belonged to them. The Galactic Empire had come across. Every continent, every screen lit up with the same message, no matter the language, no matter the location. The same voice echoed through the devices. Across homes, buildings, streets, even underground shelters and private bunkers, the voice was cold. Without emotion, and yet it carried the weight of supreme authority. It did not shout. It did not threaten. It simply spoke as though the outcome had already been decided. Humans of Earth, you are summoned by decree of the Galactic Council. You have been observed and evaluated. You are to submit peacefully and be integrated into the Empire. Refusal will result in enforcement of compliance. There was no explanation of why, no attempt to convince, no detail about what integration meant. The voice simply ended, and then a countdown appeared on screens everywhere, 24 hours ticking down second by second, across 1,000 cities. People stood frozen, some watching in disbelief, others shouting in panic, many falling silent as if the message had drained all sound from their lungs. Governments scrambled to respond. World leaders held urgent calls. Private meetings, satellite connections buzzed with confusion and fear. Military commanders looked to the skies with uncertainty, wondering if their missiles even stood a chance against something not built on Earth. No nation had an answer. No nation claimed responsibility, because this time there was no nation to blame, no war to explain. This was not a human enemy. This was something else. Entirely something far older and far more organized in a hidden facility beneath the mountains. A group of individuals gathered. They were not presidents. They were not generals. They were thinkers, strategists, speakers, people whose duty it was to understand threats and shape responses, not in bullets, but in words. At the center of the room was a large round table. No decorations, no symbols, just people in tension and screens showing the orbiting ship above. We cannot win a war, one of them said softly, not against something that can cross galaxies in silence. We cannot fight what we do not understand, another agreed. The best chance is surrender. Try to negotiate a place in their system. Keep some part of our culture alive, perhaps through cooperation. One woman suggested. A formal gesture of obedience might delay destruction. If we give them what they ask, maybe they will leave us alone. Another shook his head. They never leave anyone alone. Once they arrive, they stay. They argued and debated until the air grew heavy. The same thoughts circled over and over, but no answer felt right. They were choosing between defeat and a slower defeat. It seemed then an older man named Reed, who had been silent until then, leaned forward. His eyes calm, his voice steady, and his words unexpected. We give them an answer, he said. Not a speech, not a document, not a treaty. One word only. Others looked at him puzzled. One word will not save us, one replied. But Reed only nodded. One word will define. Using another part of the world, ordinary people reacted in their own ways. Some gathered in prayer. Others held each other in fear. Scientists locked themselves in labs, uploading data into satellites in case Earth fell and someone needed to find them. Artists began painting walls with symbols of hope or rage or defiance, and children looked to the sky, not knowing what they were looking at, but sensing it was something that mattered deeply. At the same time, the Galactic Empire remained in silence. They waited, not with curiosity, but with certainty. Their ships had done this before to hundreds of planets. Resistance was rare, and when it appeared, it was crushed quickly. They viewed Earth not as a mystery, but as another piece to fit into the grand machine. They believed they understood humanity, and they believed submission was a matter of time. They had never heard the way humans say no. As the countdown reached 12 hours, the room beneath the mountain was still. The arguing had faded. The debates had quieted. Reed's voice had stayed in the minds of all those present, and slowly they had come to understand the weight of his idea, not because it would stop the Empire, not because it was a weapon, but because it was a beginning. The beginning of a statement, the beginning of a stand. It is not a refusal, it is an identity. Reed had said it tells them that we know what they are, and we choose what we are, so. The message was prepared across the world, every major system was connected. The reply would go out in one unified voice, sent through every signal channel. The Empire had used the entire planet breathing together in one moment. One choice, one word. Outside the Empire's ship hovered without movement, lights shifting along its surface like a silent sea below. Earth turned slowly, as it always had, unaware of the changes now written into its future, and above in the darkness, something waited to hear if humanity would bow or break. The final hour came. Reed stood before the camera, nothing grand behind him, no flag, no armor, no speeches, just a face that had lived through storms and quiets. Alike the signal light blinked, and the feed began all across. Earth people watched, and in orbit, so did the Empire. Reed looked into the lens and spoke only one word, then the screen went black. The Empire had received its answer, and the galaxy would never forget it. The word echoed longer than anyone could have expected. It was not carried by volume, but by weight. It traveled through systems, through airwaves, through silence. It reached every home on Earth and every sensor aboard the Empire's watching ships, and though it was short, it stirred something old and deep, something that could not be scanned or measured or broken into pieces for study. The word was no. Inside the Empire's grand ship, the reaction was not immediate. The Council of Observers, a group formed of different species, sat in perfect posture. Their faces calm, their minds focused, their language not spoken, but transmitted through shared signals layered in precision. They had cataloged over 200 species before Earth. None had replied this way. Most offered apologies. Many offered gifts. Some simply cried. But Earth had done none of these. Earth had answered with defiance, not wrapped in fury, but in calm stillness that unsettled even the coldest mind among them. Lead observer, a tall figure wrapped in light-absorbing armor, moved slightly, not in fear, but in thought. They had once been told that humans were a reactive species, emotional, scattered, unreliable. And yet this answer had come not from panic, but from clarity. The message had not been screamed. It had been delivered like a final statement, not begging, not pleading, just firm. They do not understand what stands before them, the observer said to the others, or perhaps they do in a way. We do not expect back on Earth. The word began to spread beyond what even the speakers had intended. People wrote it on walls, painted it on signs, whispered it to their children's schools that had closed, reopened, just so teachers could discuss it. People who had never met spoke to each other, as if they shared something ancient, something stronger than fear and deeper than hope. It was not that they believed they could win. It was that they no longer believed they had to kneel in a small house near a quiet road. A grandmother told her grandson about the day tanks rolled through her city when she was young, how she had hidden in basements and waited for the sounds to stop, how her father had once stood in front of a soldier with nothing but a stick, and how even though he fell, he never gave in. She said humans have always had the power to say no, and when we say it together, it becomes something they cannot take in another place. A worker in a factory kept her machines running, even though no orders came. She told her team that if the world was ending, she would still build, she would still move, she would not sit waiting. Because humanity had not come this far to sit still when challenged. Her hands kept moving, and others followed, and the factory that made nothing now made motion, and unity. Scientists who had once fought over funding now shared knowledge without hesitation. They uploaded decades of research to open servers. They taught openly. They trained young minds without borders. No one asked about salary or position anymore. They knew now they were part of something larger, and in being part of it they became stronger. Together, military leaders who had once doubted now gathered plans not to strike but to prepare. They knew the Empire's strength, but they also knew Earth's nature. No matter the power of the enemy, humans were not designed to fold. They were designed to adapt, to bleed and crawl and rise again. They studied past resistance. They spoke to historians. They read stories of uprisings, not because they needed nostalgia, but because they needed the truth of what humans had always been. There was once a city that stood alone against an empire. There was once A village that resisted for years with only stones. There was once a man who walked across a desert to free his people, and there was once a child who faced machines with nothing but songs. The history of Earth was not one of peace, but one of meaning. And that meaning now gathered in a single word. Reed sat alone in the same room where he had spoken the word. He watched the reactions unfold, not with pride, but with purpose. He knew what had been started was not his alone, it had been born long before. He spoke it, shaped by generations who refused to accept that might makes right. He remembered his mother, who had taught him to stand even when shaking. He remembered his father, who had lost his job because he refused to lie, and he remembered the friends he had buried because the world had often chosen silence over truth. Now silence was broken. In space, the Empire observed. They sent smaller ships to monitor behavior. They analyzed data. They scanned energy output. They expected chaos, but instead, they saw organization. They saw a species preparing, but not for surrender. They saw unity, growing like a storm, not of fire, but of will, and the Council began to speak of delays, of alternative strategies, of what it meant if Earth's voice spread beyond its skies. They began to consider something they had not in centuries, that maybe power alone does not ensure control, that maybe the strength of a people is not only in their weapons, but in their refusal to be ruled. Back on Earth, messages began to reach the stars, not from governments, but from individuals, from scientists, poets, dreamers, rebels, each sending their voice into the dark, each message saying in its own way the same thing: we are not afraid of you, we are not yours, we are Earth, and we choose to remain ourselves. The Empire called it irrational, they called it primitive, but they did not call it weak, because something inside them began to sense what this could become. They had crushed armies, but never ideas, and they had never faced a word that refused to break. So the countdown continued, not toward surrender, but toward a moment no one could yet name. And across the galaxy, in quiet corners, where other conquered worlds lived in silence, some heard the word, some saw the message, some remembered what it felt like to choose. One word had been spoken, but it had awakened many more, and Earth stood ready, not to fall but to rise. Stars above Earth shimmered as they always had, but now they watched a world that had spoken a word more powerful than fire, more lasting than stone. The Galactic Empire did not move for some time. Their ships remained in perfect silence, as though frozen by something they could not fully explain. They had faced resistance before. They had seen rebellion. They had even seen species destroy themselves rather than kneel. But never had they seen this one word delivered with such calm certainty inside the lead vessel of the Empire. The Council had gathered once more, their forms tall, their voices low, their thoughts shared without emotion. They played the message over and over, not to decode it, but to understand its weight. The human had not raised his voice, he had not cursed or begged, he had simply spoken, and the weight of the word had shifted the direction of history. They believe they have a choice, one of the observers said. Their culture encouraged this illusion. Another disagreed. It is not illusion. It is something older than calculation, something we have not studied with care. They are unstable. Another said unpredictable. They must be contained. But even as these thoughts moved through the Council, doubt began to form, not in their speech, but in their stillness. The humans had done something unexpected, and in doing so had created something dangerous. They had introduced a crack into the idea of control on Earth. The people waited, but not in fear. They worked and walked and sang and listened, but above all they watched the sky, knowing what might come. Knowing that the word they had spoken was not a shield, but a message, and with messages came consequences across the cities and fields. Families gathered near radios and screens, not to hear updates, but to remain close to the heart of the world. In underground facilities, engineers activated systems not used before. Some of them had been built in secret, not by nations, but by united efforts from scattered minds, who believed one day they might be needed. They had been laughed at, dismissed, sometimes even punished, but now their time had come, and they did not hesitate. Energy grids were adjusted, defense networks were linked, old machines were powered on new ones, tested. Humanity had never built for conquest, but it had built to survive, and in every lab and command center, people did not ask if they would win. They only asked what must be done. Reed remained near the transmission base where the message had first been sent. He listened to incoming reports, but said little. His role had never been to lead by command, but to speak at the right time, and that time had already passed now. He waited like the rest, not with fear, but with readiness. He knew something had changed not only in the stars, but in the minds of his people in distant corners of the earth. The quiet ones had begun to speak. Students who had once doubted now stood in streets, sharing stories. Elders who had seen too much now told truths once buried. People who had never marched now formed lines, not with weapons, but with will, and in their eyes there was no question, only fire. Then came the movement from orbit. The Empire finally acted a shift in formation. A group of smaller ships descended from the main vessel. They were shaped like arrows, long and sharp, their surface covered in black plates. They moved with silent precision, entering Earth's atmosphere like shadows slipping through glass. There were no greetings, no warnings, only presence and pressure. World held its breath. The ships hovered above key cities, not firing, not landing, simply waiting, observing. Their sensors scanned every structure, every signal, every sound. They expected fear. They expected chaos. They received order and focus. People did not run. They watched. They stood still. Some even walked to rooftops and stared into the sky, as if daring the machines to speak. From inside the Empire's lead ship, a message was sent. Once more, not through speech, but through light, a pattern projected across the sky, visible to all, a symbol of authority, of power, of domination, a symbol that had preceded the fall of many civilizations. But on Earth, it was met with silence. And then came the response, not from the sky, but from the ground. Every screen, every light, every digital billboard, across every city displayed one word again, simple, unchanged, no music, no speech. Just the same word shown to the invaders as it had been before. No. Empire paused again. They had calculated the risks of war, but not the risk of disobedience. They could destroy cities, they could erase systems, but they could not erase the idea now born on this planet, an idea that might spread to others, that might grow beyond ships and shields, and reach places no fleet could follow. So they made a decision, one driven by fear. Though they would never admit it, they would strike not to destroy, but to shatter the spirit. They would deliver pain, not enough to end the species, but enough to remind them of their place. They selected a target, not military, not political, but symbolic, a communication tower high on a mountain known across Earth as a beacon of peace. The order was given. The ship charged its weapon. The world saw the energy gather and knew what was coming. The tower would fall, and with it, perhaps the unity would break. But Earth had prepared, from hidden platforms near the oceans, from satellites once thought inactive, from stations hidden in frozen lands, came the response, not in return fire, but in disruption. A wave of electromagnetic force scrambled the weapon systems of the incoming ship, not completely, but enough. The beam fired, but missed the tower, cutting instead through a mountain ridge far behind it. The tower stood tall, untouched, and below it people cheered. The Empire's ship began to retreat slightly, not far, just enough to signal uncertainty, and the people of Earth understood they had not defeated the Empire in strength, but they had shaken its belief in victory. They had reminded it that Earth was not a planet of fear, but of choice, and choice, once awakened, does not die easily. Above the blue planet, the Empire circled like a vulture, silent and watchful. Its ships moved in perfect lines, their lights blinking slowly, as if counting down to something unseen. The Council had grown restless, their silence no longer calm, but heavy. They had come expecting another easy submission, another forgotten species to catalog and control. Yet what they had found was resistance, not in the form of missiles or fleets, but in the form of unity. The humans had dared to say no, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with something even more dangerous, with belief. The failed strike had shaken them more than they admitted. A single communication tower had survived, but the damage was far greater than what sensors could measure. It was the message behind the survival that struck deeper than any shield. Earth had prepared. Earth had defended, and Earth had stood unbroken. The Empire knew now that the word no had not been a cry, it had been a promise on the ground. The people of Earth moved with purpose. Factories that once made simple tools now built parts for defense systems. Old bunkers were turned into command centers. Students trained alongside soldiers. Doctors worked on portable shelters. Teachers taught lessons by lantern light in case power failed. Artists painted murals across walls showing stars and fists and faces of people who had once been silent and were now heard. Reed watched all this unfold from the same mountain station where he had spoken the word. His voice was no longer needed. His presence alone had become a symbol. People came to him not for answers but to feel steadiness in the storm. He spoke little, but listened always, and in his silence there was strength. His calm told others that even now, even when the Empire shifted above like a storm waiting to fall, Earth had not changed its answer. The Empire, however, was changing. It began moving ships to different positions above Earth, each one targeting not weapons, but centers of culture, schools, museums, places of worship, symbols of identity. They wanted to strike where it would hurt not the body, but the spirit. They believed that if they shattered the heart, the mind would follow and surrender. Would come not with cries but with silence. But Earth had learned, Earth had adapted. Networks of information were now decentralized. Stories were shared by voice, by paper, by drawings on walls. If one voice was cut, 100 others would rise. If one signal died, another would begin. Humans did not need perfection to resist. They only needed memory and courage. Deep in the oceans, submarines moved with precision above the clouds. Drones monitored the stars in space. Hidden satellites awakened from decades of slumber and linked with systems built by hands long gone. Everything was moving, everything had purpose, and the Empire, watching it all, could not understand how a species so scattered could stand so firm. They decided to strike again this time with more force. They targeted a major city, one known for its history and hope, one where people had gathered in thousands after the first message had been sent. They planned to destroy it, not completely, but enough to show that resistance would only bring ruin. They believed that fear would finally do what pressure and power had not. But Earth had eyes everywhere. The plan was detected early enough to act, not to stop it completely, but to redirect it. The city was evacuated without panic, without chaos. People left homes and shops and streets, not because they were afraid, but because they knew they would rebuild. They left behind messages written on walls, on streets, on rooftops. They painted the word again and again, not just no but hope, strength, unity. They wanted the Empire to see that a city was not its stone, but its people. When the strike came, the city was empty, but not silent. It rang with songs, played on speakers left behind it, echoed with laughter, recorded by children. Days before, it glowed not with fire, but with light, powered by solar panels, set to activate just before the attack. Even as buildings crumbled, the message remained: you cannot destroy what lives in us. The Empire pulled back again, confusion spreading among its commanders. They reviewed the data again and again, trying to find logic in what they saw. But logic failed against something older, something more raw. They began to question not their weapons, but their mission. What if this species could not be broken? What if their defiance spread? What if other worlds watching decided to speak their own word of refusal? In secret corners of the Empire, distant outposts began to send silent signals, messages not of obedience, but of doubt, whispers of resistance born not from Earth, but awakened by it. Stories of Earth's stand had begun to travel through stolen signals, carried by smugglers and traders and diplomats who had seen the message and returned changed back on Earth. The people felt this shift. They did not know the details, but they sensed the change the way animals sense storms before they arrive. They saw it in the way the enemy moved slower, in the way the attack stopped short, in the way the Empire began to listen rather than demand. Reed sat by a fire one evening, looking at the stars with a group of children. One of them asked if the Empire was going to leave. He smiled, not yet, but soon. Another asked if Earth had won. He shook his head. We are still standing, and sometimes that is enough to win the rest. He knew the fight was not over. He knew more would come, more ships, more threats, more tests. But he also knew that something had already been done that could not be undone. A word had been spoken, not just by him, but by a world, and that word now echoed in places even the Empire could not reach in. The council chambers of the Empire debates turned to arguments. Some said to burn Earth, others said to watch longer, some demanded new strategies, others suggested retreat. The unity of the Empire began to splinter, not from force, but from uncertainty. They had believed they were unshakable. Now they saw cracks, now they saw risk, and in the distance far beyond Earth, on a world long conquered, a small group gathered. A cave hidden by trees, they listened to a recording smuggled from Earth. A voice saying no, followed by silence. Followed by music. One of them stood, raised a hand, and whispered the word in their own tongue, and the others joined one by one, until the cave rang with the sound of choice. The sun rose again over Earth, and it did not rise alone. With it came a feeling that had not lived in the hearts of people for many generations. Not pride, not victory, but something stronger, something deeper. It was the feeling of knowing they had faced the greatest force in the known stars, and had not kneeled, they had not begged, they had not surrendered. They had stood, and in that standing, they had spoken for every world that had ever forgotten how to speak. The Empire watched with growing silence. Its ships no longer hovered with confidence. Now they drifted slowly, their formation broken, their patterns no longer sharp. In the Grand Chamber, where the Council met, a decision had to be made, not about Earth alone, but about the structure they had built over centuries, a structure that depended on control and silence. And now both had been broken. By a world that should have collapsed, by a species that should have fallen. They reviewed transmissions from outer colonies and remote outposts and hidden cities across other worlds, and they found a pattern not of rebellion but of awakening. They found questions where there had once been obedience. They found hesitation where there had once been silence, and at the center of this shift was Earth, a small blue planet that had said one word and meant it on Earth. The people had changed, but not in a way that could be seen in streets or buildings. The change was within how they looked at each other, how they spoke, how they remembered every man and woman, every child and elder had taken part, not by fighting, not by leading, but by refusing to break. They knew now that their voices held more than sound. They held force. Reed stood once more before a camera, not to speak the same word again, but to send a message not only to the Empire, but to every world beyond the stars. The message was translated into dozens of languages, prepared by a team of volunteers who had worked for days without sleep. They wanted it clear, they wanted it honest, and above all, they wanted it true. The broadcast began, and this time the message was not short. It was not loud. It was steady, like the beat of a heart, like the rhythm of a march that never ends. Reed spoke not as a leader, but as a witness. He told them, we were told to kneel, we were told to obey. We were warned of fire and loss and silence, and still we answered with one word, and the reason we did is simple, because we have learned across our long and painful history that freedom begins with a voice, and that voice begins with choice. Did not ask other worlds to rise. He did not demand their loyalty. He simply spoke of what Earth had done and why and how, and then he ended the message with a quiet sentence that reached farther than any weapon could ever reach. He said, you always have a choice. The message traveled across stars, through hidden frequencies and broken relays. It was picked up by listening stations meant to monitor threats. It was shared by traders and explorers and wanderers, and in each place it landed, it did something the Empire could not fight. It stirred memory, it stirred thought, it stirred the idea that perhaps submission was not the only way, perhaps silence was not safety, perhaps saying no was not the end, but the beginning in one system far from Earth. A group of miners played the message and refused to load a shipment meant for the Empire in. Another, a teacher, read the words aloud to her class, and the children remembered them better than any lesson in yet. Another, a governor, turned off the Imperial beacon and declared his world free. The Empire responded in some places with force. But it was too late. The fire had already started, and fire does not ask permission to burn back. In orbit, the Empire's ships began to withdraw, not with speed, but with caution. They moved like creatures sensing danger, not from weapons, but from change. They knew now that to destroy Earth would make it a legend to spare. It might slow the wave for a while, but deep within their minds, they knew the truth. The structure they had built could no longer hold, not in the same way, not with the same strength. Because one word had made it weak. Earth watched the ships fade into the distance. No cheers, no celebration. Just quiet understanding. The war had not been won in battle. It had been won in belief, and belief is not something that ends with a retreat. It lives, it spreads, and now it had found breath in billions of lives across the stars. Reed stepped away from the camera and returned to the people, not as a hero, but as one of them. He helped move boxes and repair roofs and plant trees. The world had not been spared completely. Some cities still burned, some homes were lost, some lives mourned, but the world had stood, and now it would rebuild, not from command, not from fear, but from choice. Children born in the days after the ships left would hear the story not as a tale of war, but as a lesson. They would learn that power is not in size or number or noise. They would learn that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say no and mean it. Years later, a monument was built, not tall, not grand, but quiet. It stood in a valley where no battles were fought, made of stone taken from many lands, carved by many hands. It held no names, only a single word, and under that word a small sentence was written in many languages. Read, this was where we began again. And so Earth moved forward, not alone, but with the weight of history behind it and the winds of change ahead. Across the galaxy, other voices began to rise, other stories began to bloom, and though the Empire still existed, its grip would never again be as strong, because the moment one world says no and survives, the rest begin to ask why they said yes. In the end, Earth did not strike back with force. It struck back with something far more lasting. It struck back with meaning. End.